Have you ever wondered why some countries seem destined for poverty despite having incredible amounts of resources? Or on the contrary, why do some countries like Singapore with little to no natural resources manage to become rich while others stay poor? That's the aim of our journey today, to find the ugly truth behind why some countries seem like they will never be out of poverty. There are a few reasons why. Some which are caused by the countries themselves, and others which are beyond them. The first reason is political stability. Most poor countries have no political stability, which greatly affects their ability to grow wealth. Political stability makes it easier to implement economic policies that better the economic climate of any country. For instance, imagine a country that aims to implement capitalism and fight monopoly. Such a country would need its government to be stable for many decades, and possibly centuries. If the government is not stable, any new leader can easily reverse course on economic policies, which would affect the country's growth. Political stability is also necessary for securing investment. No investor would like a country where the government has no stability, because then it would be harder to protect their business interests in that country. When it comes to political crisis, the worst hit are countries that are at war or in armed conflict. Some countries will be undesirable for investments because of obvious reasons. A great example is Nigeria, the most populous black nation in the world. Nigeria has always had natural and human resources. However, political stability has been lacking. Since Nigeria gained independence in 1960, it went through a period of military takeovers that lasted nearly 20 years. At that time, there was often a struggle between civil institutions and military authorities. Even when Nigeria returned to full democracy, most administrations still ran civilian democracies where they had no respect for the rule of law, no free and fair elections, no media freedom, and etc. As expected, businesses have been severely affected by these political changes and their overall effect on the general populace. The second main trait of poor countries is the lack of a competitive market. As you probably know, a competitive market inspires innovation and growth because it's harder for a few companies to become monopolies. The competition in the business landscape encourages rapid growth in the economy. Even more importantly, having a competitive market leads to the production of better goods and services. If companies have no competition, it's easier for their management to become mediocre in the production of goods and services, which reduces the country's overall economic potential. In today's world, trading, whether physical or human services, is the largest creator of wealth. The third reason is technological capabilities. The more technology a nation has, the better the country's production and wealth generation. This statement has been true for thousands of years. From the prehistoric days when tribes with the best hunting tools had a higher chance of survival, to the days of the plow when nations with the best agricultural machinery were most productive. Even today, countries with the best technology like America, China, Japan, Singapore, Russia, and Israel are the richest. This is because technology generally boosts productivity, which is then traded for wealth. China, America, and the Netherlands are some of the most productive countries in agriculture, and they have the best technological tools. Many of the poor countries of the world also have agriculture, but as expected, the technological capabilities are hampered. Many of these poor countries lack the technology and the know-how to compete with the richest countries in the world. Corruption, another major factor that keeps a lot of countries in poverty. There is a direct correlation between poor countries and corrupt governments. Let me start by saying people are generally corrupt. No country is supposed to have more corruption than others. However, the countries that we consider rich have kept corruption to the barest minimum, while the poor countries of the world have rampant corruption. What differentiates these two countries in the level of corruption is strong institutions. Rich countries have strong independent institutions that only respect the rule of law. Corrupt countries like Nigeria and DR Congo have institutions that have been influenced by politicians to the point that these institutions lack merit and the ability to fight corruption. The problem with corruption is that it kills growth and development. Corruption doesn't allow governments to match financial opportunities with qualified individuals. For instance, if I were a government official tasked with building a bridge, I'm expected to go for the most qualified individuals and ensure the amount budgeted for the bridge is properly spent. In corrupt countries, such government officials will look to steal the money or employ contractors based on favoritism, often for sinister reasons. Such practice would affect the bridge and its overall economic potential. Now imagine corruption in sectors like banking and credit facilities, education, healthcare, and critical infrastructure. Corruption has become a major issue for many poor countries because it also discourages foreign trade. Investors won't come in if they know their money would be stolen or not used properly, and thus miss the economic benefits of that investment. Corruption becomes worse with something called the resource trap. The resource trap suggests that having natural resources will be beneficial to countries with strong institutions and political stability. On the other hand, it suggests that having natural resources will worsen the situation for poor and politically unstable countries. For instance, Nigeria has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. It also has a population of almost 200 million people with an average age of under 30. Nigeria also has vast lands, 2 major rivers, and access to the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, corruption and political instability marred with the violence refuse to allow the nation to grow. Nearly half of its population lives in extreme poverty. The country also has 20 million out-of-school children, yet its budgetary allocations for health and education remain disappointingly low. The country subsidizes fuel, which contributes a large portion of its debt profile, yet the oil-producing nation has no major working refinery. That's the power of corruption. It doesn't allow good policies to thrive. It also destroys the integrity of institutions that are supposed to promote the growth and development of the nation. Other historical factors have contributed to poverty in many countries, most of which can't be blamed on the country. One of these main factors is colonization. Many of the poorest countries in the world today were once colonies of other nations. Africa, for example, was largely ruled by colonial masters up until the 20th century. For many centuries, these countries lived for their colonial masters. Their population employed only to enrich the colonial masters. The system of governments in these colonies didn't focus on the upliftment of their people. Most of them simply acted as business fields for their colonial masters. Congo, for example, was owned by Belgium's King Leopold. Mind you, Belgium didn't own DR Congo, only its king. Of course, he ruled it like private property, and he had no regard for the lives and property of these native people. Nigeria was also owned by the British up until 1960. There is a term used to refer to English-speaking and French-speaking countries: Anglophone and Francophone. If you look at India, a country that recently exited multi-dimensional poverty, you'd find that it was also a colony of the British. Unfortunately, colonialism affected the pace of political and economic development of these nations. Their resources were used to develop other nations, which put those nations ahead of them in global trade. Many of these countries today are trying to play catch-up to their colonial masters. Many of them have less than 100 years as free states, so it's a bit understandable that they are government institutions that are not developed enough to meet global standards. Another issue with colonialism is how it affects the sense of nationhood these countries have. The richest countries in the world have a long sense of nationhood that has resulted from centuries of cultural identity. In areas colonized by foreign powers, you find that tribal and religious divisions still occur to a large extent. Lack of navigable rivers. There's also a known link between poor countries and no access to navigable river. Many of the poor countries we find today are landlocked. Unfortunately, this meant that for a long time, these countries were unable to move large amounts of goods and services across the sea. Of all the major means of exportation, sea travel is the oldest. Countries that had access to the sea were able to increase trade exponentially. Most trade is done through the sea. Countries that could travel across the seas had access to a wide variety of markets and nations. This allowed them to not only sell more goods and services, but also see and acquire better technology. These technological advancements also allowed them to increase their productivity and financial capabilities. Britain, for instance, always had access to the seas. This enabled them to travel to South America, Asia, Africa, etc. Tropical environments have another great effect on a country's economy. Agriculture was one of the earliest ways nations built wealth. This meant that nations with vast agricultural capabilities became the richest. Many struggling and poor countries unfortunately don't have a favourable climate for agriculture. For many centuries, this kept their population low and relatively poor, while nations with vast agricultural capabilities became richer and increased in population. Unfortunately, countries with tropical climates have suffered from low agriculture for centuries. Today, where technology can improve agricultural conditions, it's still more expensive for these nations, unlike nations with favourable climates. Why some nations are poor and others are rich is down to several reasons. Some political and economic, others cultural and historical. Some nations have a head start thanks to favourable agricultural conditions and long-term uninterrupted political stability, while others had an unfavourable agricultural climate and were victims of political instability. While it's certain that any country can rise above poverty, how long or how difficult it will be to exit poverty is affected by the conditions mentioned above. Nations like America, China, the UK, and Japan have already had a head start, and it will take some time for many nations to catch up simply with the competition in global trade. Finally, what poor nation do you think has the best chances of exiting poverty? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Bye and see you next time.